we will understand how Aristotle defended poetry against its critics. Before Aristotle, his teacher Plato had strongly criticized poetry. Plato believed that poetry could mislead people, encourage emotions instead of reason, and even present things that were false or impossible. Aristotle did not completely agree with Plato. He believed that poetry has its own purpose and should be judged by artistic standards, not by the standards of history or science. This slide explains how Aristotle answered the major criticisms against poetry. Let us understand them one by one. The 5 criticisms. On the left side, we see the 5 common criticisms made against poetry. 1. Impossible events. The first criticism is that poetry sometimes shows impossible things. For example, a poet may describe talking animals, magical creatures, or events that cannot happen in real life. Critics ask, how can this be true? Aristotle replies that poetry does not always have to present literal facts. If an impossible event is presented in a believable and meaningful way, it can still be artistically successful. He gives a famous principle. A poet should prefer a probable impossibility to an improbable possibility. What does this mean? Suppose a story contains a magical event that fits naturally into the story and the audience accepts it. That is better than a completely ordinary event that seems unbelievable or poorly explained. For example, in fairy tales, animals may speak. We know this is impossible, but within the story it feels natural, so we accept it. 2. Irrational events. The second criticism is that some events in poetry seem irrational or unreasonable. For example, a character may make a decision that appears foolish. Aristotle says that if this irrational action helps develop the story naturally and increases its emotional effect, it can be accepted. The audience should understand why the character behaves that way. Human beings are not always perfectly logical in real life either. 3. Morally harmful content. The third criticism is that poetry sometimes presents immoral actions such as murder, revenge, betrayal, or violence. Plato believed such stories could encourage people to become immoral. Aristotle disagreed. He says poetry does not teach people to become bad. Instead, tragedy shows the consequences of wrong actions. When the audience sees the suffering caused by mistakes and wrongdoing, they learn wisdom and experience catharsis. So poetry can actually educate people emotionally instead of corrupting them. 4. Contradictions. The fourth criticism is that some stories contain contradictions. For example, one part of the story may appear to disagree with another. Aristotle says we should first check whether we have understood the context correctly. Sometimes what appears to be a contradiction is actually part of the story's design. Only after careful interpretation should we criticize the poet. 5. Technical errors. The fifth criticism is that poetry may contain technical or factual mistakes. For example, a poet may incorrectly describe an animal, a weapon, or a scientific fact. Should we reject the whole poem because of one factual mistake? Aristotle says number. This brings us to his second great defense. Aristotle's 2 great defenses. On the right side of the slide, Aristotle presents 2 powerful arguments. The higher reality defense. The first is called the higher reality defense. Aristotle says that poetry is not simply a copy of facts. History tells us what actually happened. Poetry tells us what could or should happen according to probability and human nature. In other words, poetry presents a higher or universal truth. For example, a historical book tells the story of one particular king. A tragedy teaches a universal truth such as, pride often leads to downfall. That lesson applies to everyone, not just one person. Therefore, poetry can express truths that are even deeper than historical facts. The artistic efficacy defense. The second argument is called the artistic efficacy defense. Aristotle says that small factual mistakes are acceptable if they make the artistic effect stronger. Suppose an artist accidentally draws a horse with one incorrect leg position. If the picture still beautifully expresses speed, power, and movement, people admire the painting instead of focusing on the small mistake. Similarly, in literature, the most important question is not, is every fact perfectly correct? The important question is, does the story achieve its artistic purpose? If it creates pity, fear, emotional impact, and catharsis, then it has succeeded as literature. Conclusion. So, the main message of this slide is that Aristotle strongly defended poetry against its critics. He argued that poetry should not be judged only by factual accuracy or scientific correctness. Instead, it should be judged by its artistic effectiveness and its ability to express universal truths about human life. Even if a poem contains an impossible event or a small factual mistake, it can still be a great work of art if it is believable within the story, emotionally powerful, and successfully produces catharsis. This defense of poetry became one of Aristotle's greatest contributions to literary criticism and remains influential even today. So far, we have studied Aristotle's ideas about mimesis, tragedy, plot, tragic hero, catharsis, diction, and the defense of poetry. Now this slide explains why Aristotle's Poetics is still considered one of the greatest books of literary criticism even after more than 2,000 years. The slide presents three major contributions of Aristotle's Poetics. Let us understand them one by one. 1. Structuralism. Literature has a structure. The first contribution is structuralism. Aristotle believed that literature is not created by accident. Before Aristotle, Plato often suggested that poets wrote because of divine inspiration or madness. Aristotle disagreed. He believed that a great poem or play is created through careful planning and proper structure. According to him, every tragedy should have a clear beginning, middle, and end. Every event should be connected to the next. Nothing unnecessary should be included. Think about building a house. A strong house needs a proper foundation, walls, roof, and doors. If one important part is missing, the house becomes weak. Similarly, a tragedy needs a strong plot, suitable characters, meaningful ideas, beautiful language, music, and stage presentation. Every part has its own function. This is why Aristotle is considered one of the earliest thinkers to study the structure of literature in a systematic way. 2. The autonomy of art. The second contribution is called the autonomy of art. The word autonomy means independence. Aristotle says that literature should be judged according to its own artistic rules, not according to history, politics, or science. For example, history asks, did this event actually happen? Science asks, is this fact scientifically correct? But literature asks a different question. Does this story successfully express human experience and create the intended emotional effect? For example, a historical book tells us exactly what happened in one battle. A tragedy may change some details but teaches a universal truth such as, pride leads to downfall, or, every action has consequences. Even if the story is fictional, the lesson may still be true. That is why Aristotle says poetry has its own standard of correctness. It should be judged as literature, not as history or science. This idea completely changed literary criticism because it gave literature its own independent value. 3. Psychological engineering. The third contribution is psychological engineering. This means Aristotle carefully explained how literature affects the human mind. He showed that a well-constructed tragedy is not just entertainment. It is designed to create a psychological response. Earlier, we learned about Peripeteia, which is reversal, and Anagnorisis, which is discovery. These events make the audience feel pity and fear. Finally, these emotions lead to catharsis, or emotional purification. Think about watching a very emotional movie. While watching it, you may cry, feel worried, or become deeply moved. But after the movie ends, you feel lighter, calmer, and emotionally satisfied. This is exactly what Aristotle meant. He explained that literature has the power to influence human emotions in a healthy and meaningful way. Even today, Psychologists agree that stories, films, and dramas can influence our thoughts, emotions, and understanding of life. This shows how far ahead of his time Aristotle was. Conclusion. So, the main message of this slide is that Aristotle's Poetics remains valuable because it changed the way people understand literature. It taught that literature has a carefully designed structure, which is called structuralism. It established that literature should be judged by its own artistic standards, which is known as the autonomy of art. And it explained how stories influence the human mind through pity, fear, and catharsis, which we can call psychological engineering. Because of these three great contributions, Aristotle's Poetics became the foundation of Western literary criticism, and its ideas continue to influence literature, drama, films, and storytelling even in the modern world. This slide explains how Aristotle's ideas influenced literary criticism over the centuries. Although Aristotle wrote Poetics more than 2,300 years ago, scholars have continued to discuss, follow, criticize, and reinterpret his ideas. This slide shows that journey in three important stages. Let us understand each stage one by one. Stage 1. Renaissance and Neoclassicism, 16th–18th century. The first stage is the Renaissance and Neoclassical period, which lasted roughly from the 16th to the 18th century. During this period, European scholars rediscovered Aristotle's Poetics and admired it greatly. However, there was one important problem. Many critics treated Aristotle's observations as strict laws instead of helpful principles. For example, Aristotle mainly emphasized the unity of action. He only suggested that tragedy usually covers a short period of time. He never clearly demanded the unity of place. But later French critics and dramatists, such as Corneille and Racine, converted Aristotle's ideas into rigid rules. They insisted that every play must follow the three unities: unity of action, unity of time, unity of place. They also demanded strict rules about language, character behavior, and dramatic decorum. As a result, many writers felt that creativity became restricted. So, during this period, Aristotle was often misunderstood as a writer who created strict rules for literature. In reality, he was describing how successful tragedies generally worked, not forcing every writer to follow fixed laws. Now let us move to the next stage. Stage 2. Romantic Rebellion, 19th century. In the 19th century, a new literary movement called Romanticism appeared. The Romantic writers strongly opposed the strict rules of Neoclassicism. They believed that literature should come from imagination, emotion, personal experience, and individual genius, not from fixed rules. For them, creativity was more important than discipline. For example, poets like William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Percy Bysshe Shelley believed that poetry was the spontaneous expression of powerful feelings. They felt that strict Aristotelian rules limited artistic freedom. As a result, many Romantic critics rejected Aristotle's influence, although in reality they were mostly rejecting the neoclassical interpretation of Aristotle rather than Aristotle himself. This period can therefore be called a rebellion against rigid literary rules. Now let us move to the final stage. Stage 3. Modern re-evaluation, 20th century and beyond. During the 20th century, scholars returned to Aristotle's original text. They carefully studied Poetics again. This time they discovered something very important. They realized that Aristotle was not a dictator who forced writers to follow rigid rules. Instead, he was a careful observer. He studied successful tragedies and tried to explain why they worked so well. Modern critics now see Aristotle as the first scientific literary critic. Rather than saying, "You must write exactly like this," Aristotle was actually asking, "What makes a story effective?" Modern literary theories, especially structuralism, narratology, and reader response theory, still use many ideas that Aristotle first introduced. His discussions of plot, character, conflict, reversal, recognition, and catharsis continue to influence novels, dramas, films, television series, and even modern storytelling. So today, Aristotle is respected not as a rule maker, but as one of the greatest thinkers in literary criticism. Conclusion. So, the main message of this slide is that Aristotle's influence has changed over time. During the Renaissance and Neoclassical period, his ideas were turned into strict literary rules. During the Romantic period, writers rejected those rigid rules in favor of imagination and personal freedom. Finally, in the modern period, scholars returned to Aristotle's original work and recognized that he was not prescribing fixed laws, but carefully explaining the principles that make literature artistically successful. This is why Aristotle's Poetics continues to remain relevant even today. It is not simply an ancient book about Greek tragedy. It is a timeless guide to understanding how stories are structured, why they affect human emotions, and what makes great literature truly great. We compare Aristotle's Poetics with two other important approaches to literary criticism. These are New Criticism, a 20th-century literary theory; Sanskrit Poetics, especially Bharata Muni's rasa theory. Although these theories developed in different countries and different time periods, they all try to answer one important question: what makes a literary work successful? However, each theory gives a different answer. Let us understand each one. 1. Aristotle. Structure and effect. Let us begin with Aristotle. Aristotle believed that the quality of literature depends mainly on its structure. He carefully examined how a story is built. He asked questions like, is the plot complete? Are all the events connected? Does the story have a beginning, middle, and end? Does it create pity and fear? Does it finally produce catharsis? According to Aristotle, a literary work should be judged by how well its parts work together. Think of a machine. If every part of the machine works properly, the machine performs efficiently. Similarly, if every part of a tragedy, plot, character, thought, diction, melody, and spectacle, works together, the tragedy becomes successful. Sir Aristotle mainly focuses on structure and emotional effect. 2. New Criticism, the autonomous text. Now let us move to New Criticism. This literary theory became popular during the 20th century. New critics believed that the literary work itself should be the center of attention. They argued that we do not need to know about the author's life, personal opinions, or historical background. Instead, we should study only the text itself. For example, if we are reading a poem by William Wordsworth, new critics would say, do not ask, what happened in Wordsworth's life? Instead ask, how do the words, images, symbols, rhythm, and structure work together to create meaning? This idea is actually very similar to Aristotle. Like Aristotle, new critics believe that literature should be judged by its internal structure, not by outside information. That is why many scholars say that new criticism continues the Aristotelian tradition in modern literary criticism. 3. Sanskrit Poetics, rasa theory. Now let us compare Aristotle with Sanskrit Poetics. The most famous Sanskrit literary theory is rasa theory, developed by Bharata Muni in the Natyashastra. Like Aristotle, Bharata Muni believed that literature should create an emotional experience. But the two thinkers explain this experience differently. Aristotle says that tragedy mainly produces pity and fear, which finally lead to catharsis, or emotional purification. Bharata Muni says that literature creates rasa. The word rasa literally means taste or flavor. Just as food has different flavors, literature also creates different emotional flavors. For example, love creates Sringara rasa, heroism creates Veera rasa, compassion creates Karuna rasa, laughter creates Hasya rasa. According to Bharata Muni, the audience does not simply release emotions. Instead, they experience and enjoy these universal emotions in an artistic form. So while Aristotle focuses on catharsis, Bharata Muni focuses on rasa. Both theories study emotions, but they explain emotional experience in different ways. Comparison. Let us now compare all three theories together. Aristotle asks, is the story well constructed, and does it produce catharsis? New Criticism asks, how does the text itself create meaning through its internal structure? Sanskrit Poetics asks, Which emotional flavor or rasa does the audience experience? So all three theories value literature, but each looks at it from a different perspective. Conclusion. So, the main message of this slide is that different literary theories study literature in different ways. Aristotle emphasizes structure, plot, and emotional purification through catharsis. New criticism emphasizes the text itself, studying its language, imagery, symbolism, and structure without depending on the author's biography or historical background. Sanskrit poetics emphasizes rasa, the aesthetic enjoyment of universal emotions experienced by the audience. Although these approaches differ, they all help us appreciate literature more deeply. Together, they remind us that great literature is not just about telling a story. It is about creating meaning, shaping emotions, and giving readers a richer understanding of human life. Thank you. This concludes our study of Aristotle's Poetics and its lasting influence on literary criticism. Instead of introducing a new theory, this slide helps us understand how Aristotle evaluates whether a tragedy is truly successful. Think of it as a diagnostic checklist. Just as a doctor examines a patient by asking important questions before giving a diagnosis, Aristotle examines a literary work by asking a few important questions. If the answers are positive, the tragedy is considered successful. Let us understand these questions one by one. Question 1. Does the plot follow probability and necessity? The first question asks, does the plot rely on accidental events, or does every event happen because of probability and necessity? This question helps us evaluate the unity of action. Aristotle believed that every event in a tragedy should naturally lead to the next event. Nothing should happen simply by chance. For example, imagine a detective story. Suppose the detective suddenly finds the criminal because the criminal accidentally leaves his wallet on the road. That would seem unrealistic and weak. But if the detective carefully collects clues, questions witnesses, and finally discovers the criminal through logical investigation, the story becomes much stronger. This is what Aristotle means by probability and necessity. Every event should have a clear cause and effect. Therefore, the first test of a good tragedy is a well-organized plot. Question 2. Why does the hero suffer? The second question asks, does the hero suffer because he is completely evil, or because of a mistake or blind spot? This question examines Hamartia, or the tragic flaw. Aristotle says the ideal tragic hero is not a villain. He is generally a good person but makes a serious mistake. For example, in Oedipus Rex, Oedipus is not a cruel king. He genuinely wants to save his people. However, because of his ignorance and excessive confidence, he unknowingly discovers that he himself is the cause of the city's suffering. His downfall comes from Hamartia, not from wickedness. This makes the audience feel both pity and fear. So Aristotle asks us to examine the reason behind the hero's downfall. Question 3. Do reversal and discovery happen together? The third question asks, does the greatest turning point happen at the same moment as the hero's greatest realization? This evaluates Peripeteia and Anagnorisis. We learned earlier that Peripeteia means a sudden reversal of fortune. Anagnorisis means recognition or discovery. According to Aristotle, the finest tragedies combine these two events. Again, let us think about Oedipus Rex. At the exact moment Oedipus discovers the shocking truth that he has unknowingly killed his father and married his mother, his entire life changes. The king becomes a broken man. His greatest discovery and his greatest downfall happen together. This creates an extremely powerful emotional effect. That is why Aristotle considered this the highest form of tragic construction. The final message. Now let us read the statement at the bottom of the slide. It says, the rules of poetics are not artifacts of antiquity, they are the enduring blueprint of human empathy. This is a very important conclusion. It means Aristotle's ideas are not old-fashioned rules that belong only to ancient Greece. Instead, they explain something permanent about human nature. Even today, modern novels, films, television series, and dramas continue to use Aristotle's principles. When we watch a movie with a strong plot, a believable hero, an unexpected twist, and an emotional ending, We are still experiencing the same principles that Aristotle explained more than 2,000 years ago. This is why his ideas continue to remain relevant today. Final conclusion. So, the main message of this slide is that Aristotle provides us with a practical method for evaluating literature. He asks three simple but powerful questions. Is the plot logically connected through probability and necessity? Does the hero fall because of Hamartia, rather than pure evil? Do Peripeteia and Anagnorisis combine to produce a powerful emotional experience? If the answer to these questions is yes, then according to Aristotle, the work is likely to be an effective tragedy. These principles continue to guide writers, critics, filmmakers, and readers even today. Thank you very much for your patient listening. Subscribe, share and like the video.